Chapter 5.
What in the deepest holes was that?
Ganner panted and shook his head. He fumbled for his skin and raised it to his lips, drinking heartily from the tepid water in it and then gasping for breath.
Seems we all have secrets.
Slab it. And Ganner turned to see Arika approaching. She was nude and bleeding from some cuts in her skin. They were scratches and gouges, nothing deep or dangerous. She carried the breastplate in her hand and the batching backplate in her other.
What's that?
These should fit you. Made of the strongest metal you'll find on this realm. Takes magic and a skilled smith to forge it.
You're daft. That's not... Damn my eyes, that be adamantine.
I've heard of that.
Try it on. Better than that smelly hide you're wearing.
Ganner huffed and worked to untie his damaged and dirty metal-studded leather jerkin off. With Slab's help, he got the new breastplate in pipe unbuckled and felt the weight on his shoulders and back. It was stiffer, but it supported itself on him better.
Thank you.
You got me a dress. I got you armor.
The difference is, I'm wearing mine.
Slab did a double take and then laughed and looked away.
Sorry, I forgot. Not every day I see one person breathe fire and another lightning.
Part of what they did to me. I can hum and build up a power in me while I focus on where I want it to go. It creates some sort of conduit. The power flows through. It doesn't go too far, though, and as you saw, it takes a lot out of me to do.
Spared us a fight we didn't need.
Arika pointed at another passage.
There are more goblins that way.
Course there are. Little buggers breed like rabbits.
Lady Arika.
Raisin offered her discarded dress to her after he got her attention.
Thank you.
She slipped it over her head and pulled it back into place before turning to look at where Theo and Delaney were both sitting on the ground. The elf was awake, and from the looks of him, in no danger of dying right away.
Stabbed. Theo's got the touch, though. He's a real healer.
Arika nodded at the blood on his cheek.
You should get him to look at you.
I will. I got stabbed. Last I saw that goblin was stuck on some rocks. Then he snuck up and stabbed me. Cut my bowstring too.
Do you have another bowstring?
Yes, planned to fix that in a minute.
Slab glanced at the tunnel Arika had mentioned.
Sooner be better than later.
Why didn't they join the fray?
They didn't run. They backed away. There's something down there. Something they want to protect.
Bowstring it is then.
Raisin turned and limped back to where he'd dropped his bow, tugging at his leather so he could inspect the wound in his side. He found the leaky hole in his skin and placed his hand over it to stop the bleeding. Ganner followed and said,
Stay together.
Seems there still be some secrets here.
You've seen what I can do.
I might have some more tricks left, but I haven't tried them much.
What's that supposed to mean?
Apparently there's magic that runs through my blood, or so they claimed.
I've got magic in me too.
No, not like that. Blood magic.
The dwarf looked at him and stroked his beard.
Go on.
Ganner sighed.
Their plan was to use me as proof they could give a person the ability to reach out to others and control them through their blood.
What?
What?
I can feel it and I know I can use it. I just haven't since I got away from them. It's not an easy thing to do.
Like you spitting lightning.
Sort of. Worse, though.
Slab grunted and then turned to where Raisin walked back over to them. He didn't appear to be limping anymore, and the blood was drying on his clothes in the dry heat of the caves.
What about you?
Raisin looked at him.
Me?
You're a wizard too?
Raisin grinned.
No, nothing like that.
The dwarf snorted.
You cast a spell or I'm a goblin's mother.
I did. I've always been fascinated by magic. Why do you think I was trying to learn more about it.
Seems you did.
Raisin shrugged.
I learned it seems to be a lot of work to be a proper wizard, more than I could put up with. I pick up a few tricks and don't mind learning a bit here and there. It does fascinate me.
Not enough for me to keep at it, though. I get distracted too easily. Slab snorted again. Silence fell between them, so Theo took the opportunity to announce,
Well,
None of you will be dying on my watch. At least, not right now. These goblins.
They're so savage, so violent.
Not like the ones I've met.
That's exactly how goblins are, where I come from.
These gobs be different for sure. Fire and heat doesn't bother them. You see the chief when that hound of hell breathed fire on his feet? Burned his sandals clean off, but he walked on like he was heading to the tavern on his way home from work.
They seem hardy, for sure. Toughened by their environment, perhaps?
Bah, living in a hot cave don't mean you can ignore being burnt up.
To be protected from such a thing is a sign of the favor of a powerful being.
Here we go.
No, that makes sense. The fairy sent us here because of that, right?
Arika nodded and turned to the passage the goblins had backed down.
That's right. Whatever it is that's protecting them is probably down that passage.
Delani sniffed at a wineskin he found on one of the goblins that Ganner had electrocuted. He winced and then shrugged and took a drink from it. He smacked his lips and said,
I'm ready if you are.
Arika studied the healed elf for a moment.
What was that you threw before they came at you?
What?
The goblins and their pet. You threw something and slowed them down. What was it?
Oh, I'm not really sure. I found it when we were in that shop. I tested it out, and it didn't smell like anything, so I got a little dab on my finger. It was really, really slippery. Like, I couldn't hold anything with it for hours.
Some sort of lubricant?
Lubricant?
It reduces wear and tear on parts that touch each other, makes them easier to move.
Master needs some sort of lubrication when he fucks most women in the arse.
The 5 men stopped what they were doing and turned to stare at her, most with jaws agape.
Not me. I prefer he take me without it.
The silent and shocked stares persisted until Delani pulled his thoughts together.
Well, anyhow, the vial shattered and spread across the cave floor. When they ran across it, they slipped and fell. Except the chief, as you saw. He managed to keep his balance and came right at us.
Probably saved our lives. Otherwise, they might have been able to overrun us before we could set up and be ready.
Delani beamed at the praise.
Any more tricks or potions you've picked up along the way?
I don't think so. This goblin swill doesn't count, does it?
Hardly,
So the other passage next?
They know we're coming.
but the more time we give them, the better they can dig in.
He's right. Let's go.
I'll lead the way then.
I'm right behind you.
Slab shook his head and turned to Theo.
Fool elf's going to get himself stabbed again.
Seems likely. It's his lesson to learn, though.
Maybe next time you don't heal him so good. Leave him limping or sleeping or something?
He means well, and he is still our companion.
Slab huffed and hurried over to slip in beside the elf before they reached the entrance to the unknown passage. Delani greeted him with a grin and a wave.
Don't be doing nothing stupid.
Delani grinned.
I'm fit as a songbird after a rain, thanks to Saint. What could go wrong?
Chapter 6. The passage narrowed into a natural choke point, only wide enough for one at a time for several feet. The heated air was stifling in the new tunnel, teasing them with thoughts of what fiery horrors might await them. Ganner held his sword at the ready and peered into the flickering shadows ahead. Theo held the torch, and he was several people back, blocking most of the light. Fortunately for the warrior, the passage widened to more than 10 feet and then grew wider still as it opened up before them. The cavern was lit with a sinister red glow that came from deeper into the mountain. The others joined Ganner in time to see 2 goblins with the same hide and leather makeshift armor and weapons at their sides at the ready. Behind them, a 3rd goblin wearing a loincloth made from the hide of some unfortunate creature was kneeling at a crudely carved stone altar. The goblin's back was scarred from multiple burns. A final goblin stood near the nearly naked one, a goblin-sized spear in his hand.
Those are the 2 I saw earlier.
Hello. Sorry about the others.
The goblin threw his spear at the elf. Delani snapped into motion and reached out with confidence, fueled by goblin wine. He grabbed the shaft of the spear as it began to pass by him and twisted, spinning about in place and throwing it back down the passage. The goblin that had thrown the weapon in the first place stared in shock at the spear sailing at him. He was so stunned he did nothing but hold his hands out at the last possible moment. The dull edge of the spear's bladed tip ripped a vicious cut from his left hand and down his forearm. Ganner rushed forward, seizing the unlikely momentum Delani had given them. He swept his sword across in a two-handed crushing blow that overpowered the goblin's raised club and hacked into his shoulder. The goblin fell to the side and rolled across the ground, reaching for the ghastly wound on his arm, and howled when his hand came away bloody. Slab stepped out from behind Delani and sent forth another of his frozen beams of magic. It struck the hopping and hollering goblin that Delani had injured. The goblin spun and tried to jump out of the way as the super-chilled forces froze skin and hair that were accustomed to the fiery depths of the caves. His antics spared him the arrow that Raisin shot at him, but in his staggering, he tripped on the uneven ground and struck his head against the side of the rock altar. He lay still on the ground, an unintended sacrifice to the goblin's god. The other goblin was already swinging for Ganner. The blade on his sword was blackened, but that didn't help it against the new cuirass Ganner wore. His sword bounced back and Ganner riposted, only to have his cut sail over the goblin's head. Arika rushed forward, moving across the cave floor as fast as she dared in her shoes. The goblin priest saw her coming and moved to put Ganner and the remaining guard between them. Arika thought him a coward trying to buy more time until the priest's ploy was revealed. Flames erupted from his hands and curled out, curling and rolling over on themselves like a giant ball. Ganner and the goblin stood directly in their path, and then Arika would plunge into them next. Arika pushed off her left foot, angling her momentum, so she struck Ganner on his right side and pushed him out of the way. She slammed into the goblin and felt his sword slice across her thigh. Then the priest's spell swept over them, turning everything red, orange, and yellow around her. The hot air of the cavern would have been a blessing. Instead, she clenched her teeth and held her breath while her dress combusted and added to the fire that licked hungrily at her flesh. The spell ended as quick as it began, leaving the rock underground scorched and blistering to the touch. The goblin gasped and cried out, reaching his hands up toward the altar and giving thanks in his mindless devotion. His sword was gone, dropped and probably trapped beneath them. Arika felt the tightness across her body from where her skin had gone to protect her from the fire. She also felt something else. Something soft and, somehow, a little hairy. The goblin that lay half under her had his hides burnt away too, save for a few pieces that had been trapped between them. His excitement at being immolated with holy magic had caused another reaction as well, one that poked Arika in the hip. Arika lifted her head up and glared at the priest. The goblin's triumphant grin vanished as he saw her. Even her long blonde hair hadn't been burnt to a crisp. Arika put a hand down, claws wrapping around the goblin warrior's face, and she lifted his head and then slammed it back into the rocky floor. The wet crunch and sudden give in his skull signaled his end. Arika rose to her feet, a few flaming bits of cloth clinging to her skin, and then dropped about her feet. Delani's boomerang swung through the air and clipped the top of the goblin shaman's head, startling him out of his shock at seeing Arika arising like a vengeful spirit. He looked around and then his eyes fell on the altar. He stared at it long enough that Ganner was able to rush up to him and place his sword, point first, against the goblin's neck. The shaman ignored Ganner and continued to stare at Arika. His knees wobbled and he dropped, kneeling as he faced her and then reaching up beseechingly toward her.
Since you like to play with fire so much, try this.
Arika took in a deep breath, held it for a heartbeat so she could raise her hands in front of her face and strike her claws against each other as she let it out. Ganner staggered back as the spark ignited flames that washed over the goblin and the altar behind him. They lasted until her breath ran out a few seconds later. When it was over, the shaman was swaying back and forth, surrounded the ashes of his clothing and belongings. His hair was smoking and singed, and his skin was reddened. His cheeks showed blisters that swelled and grew before their eyes. but the intense fire had not killed him. Ganner stepped back in and swung his sword before the situation could escalate any further. The goblin's head toppled free and rolled across the floor. The guard that had lost the use of his arm, even it was still attached. Let out an abrupt squawk from where he'd crawled. Raisin pulled his rapier free and wiped the blood off on the goblin's leathers. Delani picked up his boomerang that had bounced off the cavern wall as it tried to return to him, and he waved at the others. His eyes fell on Arika, standing gloriously nude before the altar, and he found his mouth and throat were dry. The goblin wine, or what was left of it, seemed a natural solution. Arika looked down at herself and frowned.
I like that dress.
We'll get you another.
Arika shrugged it off.
Fire doesn't hurt them.
Slab walked up to join them, adding,
Told you that.
It hurt him, just not enough. Seems they aren't the only ones.
It hurt me too.
Your skin's darker, like you be laying in the sun too long. Hair's got a touch of red to it too.
Theo stepped up next to Arika. He kept his eyes averted from her more private areas, though she stood displaying herself openly and without a care.
May I?
You may. And thank you.
Theo smiled and whispered a prayer to before placing a hand on her left shoulder and softly brushing it across her upper chest to her right shoulder. The healing magic flowed into her, cooling her briefly and spreading down her body. Delani gasped as Arika's skin seemed to tremble and wave that spread across her body from her shoulders out to her extremities. As it passed, it left behind lighter skin. Even her hair lightened back to its regular, glorious blonde color.
I have some spare clothes in my pack too.
Arika held up a hand.
Later, perhaps. For now, let's finish this.
Wait, didn't we just finish it? This was the priest, right? And the altar, with him gone, isn't that enough?
Ganner grunted and pointed his sword deeper into the cavern, where the red glow came from.
My bet is we find what we need there.
Oh, damn.
It'd be hotter there for sure.
Chapter 7. The reddish glow that painted the walls and spilled into the goblin's shrine was lava. Once they walked past the shrine a couple dozen feet, the rock ended at a rounded and smooth edge, making it look like molten black glass. The heat intensified as they approached, stealing their breath and making their skin tingle. A few more feet and the molten rack was visible, only a few feet below the edge.
That's hot.
Raisin pointed into the shimmering air that rose above the magma. A column of rock rose above the lava in the middle of the roughly circular pool, but it ended 3 feet above the liquid rock. There were some objects lying on top of it, objects that had no right to be there since placing them there meant either great aim or walking across more than 10 feet of lava. Theo looked up, twisting his neck to see the ceiling of the room rose up above them, but only a few more feet. He mopped the sweat from his face and held his arm up to block the heat radiating out.
So this is what we have to stop?
Delani turned to her and stood mesmerized. Arika stood bathed in the lava's hellish glow. She looked spectacular, if a bit intimidating for her incredible body, almost as though she belonged in a nightmare landscape such as this. Horns and a tail would have fit right at home on her. Perhaps wings and...
How do we stop lava?
Everybody pee on it?
Slab ignored Raisin and pointed his thick fingers at the smooth-sided column of rock.
Them things. How they get there. And why?
Slab's question pulled Delani's gaze away from Arika before he started drooling.
Let me go ask a goblin and... Oh, wait. They're all dead.
Slab scowled and wiped away sweat that was dripping down his brow.
No need, that's not the point.
It's not?
No, they be there. That's fact enough.
It means there's some significance to them. They must play a part in it. I think I see a knife there, and some sort of shiny material. I can't make it out for all the way the heat makes things look like a mirage in the desert.
You think it's not real?
If it's not real, why are we all seeing the same thing?
Delani had to back away a few steps.
The heat's making me feel funny.
Hold on.
Slab backed up a bit himself and rooted around in his pack. He pulled out a pair of slender quartz crystals and some sort of powder. He began to chant arcane words over and over until finally the crystals began to float in the air in front of him. He kept chanting while sprinkling the powder in the air so it fell around the crystals, turning into tiny fireflies of light that disappeared just as quickly when they touched the crystals.
What in the name of the saint of drunken spirits is he doing?
Don't blaspheme. There's no such saint.
Maybe there should be.
Theo frowned and opened his mouth to say more. He remained silent instead because Slab grabbed the crystals out of the air, one in each hand, and walked back closer to the lava. The wizard held the crystals a handspan apart and framed the column between them. He grunted and nodded before backing away again.
Magic, whatever them things are. They be magical.
A sacrifice?
Makes sense.
But for what?
Slab frowned and raised his crystals again. He peered through them as he studied the pit of lava. He made a few more non-committal grunts before raising them and scanning the walls as well. Finally, sweat running down his face almost like water trickling over a cliff, he retreated and said,
Whole damn pit has magic. Different sorts. My bet is those things be the key to it.
So do we need to remove them?
How are we going to do that? Do you have wings too?
Delaney gawked at her.
Wings? Really? Do you?
Arika smirked. Her skin glistened with sweat, increasing her hellish beauty. But even with that, she didn't look as hard-pressed by the heat as the others. Her hair remained vibrant and beautiful, not drenched in sweat and plastered to her head and shoulders.
I do not.
Well, I might have a way.
Raisin smiled and swiped away sweat from beneath and above his eyes with a finger.
I do have some tricks for locating and removing hard-to-get items.
Slab and Ganner both snorted. Raisin moved back closer to the edge. He held one arm up to shield his face from the lava's heat and used the other to reach out toward the column. He whispered quick words to a spell and then began to move his hand as though he was next to the column instead of a dozen feet away. Miraculously, the dagger lying on top teetered and then rose up into the air, mirroring Raisin's hand movements. It floated across the pond of lava and landed softly at Raisin's feet.
That's amazing.
Stop that. Let him focus.
Slab squeezed his beard, wringing out sweat from it, and said,
I might could use a telekinesis spell like that.
Off to their left, a bubble rose in the lava and burst, sending tiny droplets of magma flying through the air, only to land back in the pool.
I can't lift much with it.
Raisin then began plucking some other, smaller objects off the shimmery fabric.
It's more for fine work, sleight of hand and picking locks at a distance.
The magma hissed and spit off to their right this time, sending a fresh gout of sulfurous stink into the air. They recoiled and wrinkled their noses.
Guess I'm not as used to it as I thought I was.
Delaney gagged and retched. Raisin persevered, and one at a time, he deposited the objects at his feet. The pool of molten rock grew more and more agitated, bubbling and spitting randomly. A few droplets landed on the rock near them, but he was so focused on his task he ignored them. Ganner and Theo moved forward, ready to grab him if things got worse. By the time he'd finished with the small objects, he had a pile of 4 of them at his feet. One was a clear gemstone. Another was a ring with a blue gem set in it. The third, a bracelet wrought with silver, gold, platinum, and jade. The final small object was a brooch with rubies set into it. Slab studied them all with his crystals as they landed and grunted in surprise. He didn't share the source of his grunt, though. The lava was becoming too unruly to draw their attention away from. Several more glowing spatters of molten rock landed on the cave floor near them.
One more.
The final item Raisin lifted seemed a simple piece of fabric, but he couldn't make it out, nor could he figure out why he struggled and had to focus so hard his head began to hurt. He lifted it at last from the surface of the column, and as soon as it was free, the ground under them rumbled.
Uh-oh.
Hurry.
The distraction caused the garment to drop. It fell straight away, not at all like a piece of cloth might flutter with the updraft of hot air rising. It struck the roiling lava and floated on top for an impossible moment. Sweat streaming down his face, Raisin squinted his eyes and bent his will to reclaiming the final item and bringing the garment to him. It rose from the lava, dripping a few glowing orange bits and then floating slowly through the air toward him. He raised it up higher to clear the ledge, and then a nearby bursting bubble of lava sent droplets of magma that burned through his pants and scorched his thigh. Raisin cried out, his concentration broken by the fiery pain in his leg. Delaney reacted without thinking and threw himself forward. He swept his staff out as he slid to the edge of the lava pit and swatted the falling fabric safely onto the rock. The heat so close to the edge had him scrambling even before he stopped moving. He rolled and leapt up, trying to let his bare skin not touch the hot rock for more than a fraction of a second. He even reached down and scooped up the garment as he danced away and rejoined them.
You fool.
Theo had spoken for all of them as they watched, expecting Delaney's hand was going to melt before their eyes. The elf looked at him, his triumphant grin fading at the criticism.
I'm okay.
Everyone was staring at the finely woven mail in his hand.
How are you holding that? Should be burning your hand off.
Delaney lifted it up and looked at it.
Oh, you're right. It's not. It's warm, but not hot.
Raisin limped closer to him and reached out to touch it. His eyebrows shot up.
He's right. It feels right, if that makes sense.
Ganner reached over and touched it and then grunted.
I'll be damned.
That thing and the dagger got magic in them.
Raisin held it up, revealing it to be a shirt of mail so finely wrought he'd never seen its like.
Mithril, a fine bit of work went into that. Not so easy to make from what I hear.
From what you hear, you're a dwarf. Don't you know all about it?
Slab turned slowly to the priest. Before he could speak, the ground rumbled again. The rumble turned into a proper shake that sent them all staggering.
What's going on?
Raisin scooped up the dagger and then grabbed for the jewelry and gemstone. He hissed as they burnt his fingers.
Leave them.
But,
The echo of a rock crashing came down the corridor. Raisin changed his tune while starting to move away from the bubbling and surging lava pool. He tucked the dagger away and made the mail shirt disappear as he moved.
move your arses.
The others followed behind, letting him lead them back through the caves and past the bodies of the goblins they'd left behind. The cook fire in the goblins' main cavern was all but burnt out. All around, fallen stalactites lay shattered on the ground, making each step a risky of shifting rocks. The ground lurched beneath them as they ran, and a great cough of sulfurous air blasted over them from behind. Delaney wasn't the only one to stumble and gag, but he seemed the worst, even though Theo had actually fallen down. The priest picked himself up with Ganner's help, and they stumbled on while the mountain came alive around them. The charred bones in the pit welcomed them with fresh terror, but other than some uneven footing, there was nothing waiting for them. The rats had already fled for safer grounds. One or another of them would shout out encouragement or warnings as they ran, but deafening sounds of rocks grinding and crashing behind them were too loud. They plunged out the entrance and, for a terrible instant, Raisin feared he'd taken a wrong turn. It was still dark. Had they ended up in another cavern?
Saints preserve us!
Theo called out as the constant rumble and crash began to fall behind them to more of a muffled roar now. They turned and saw him staring up into the night sky where a thick black plume of smoke reached for the twinkling heavens. Glowing orange and red lights shone as they streaked skywards, only to slow and fall back down. One such hurtling mass struck the ground on a nearby hill and burst with a sharp report that made them all cringe. Fiery rocks scattered from the impact, igniting fires where they landed if there was anything nearby that might burn.
We've got to get out of here.
Where?
The lake be poisoned. No refuge there.
Raisin cursed under his breath.
Back to Satine. She did this.
We did this. Well, mostly you, but still.
He's right. That bitch tricked us. Let's go.
An explosive crack behind them drew their attention up the mountainside. More rocks were hurtling upwards into the growing column of smoke. Orange and red molten rock began to crest over the top of the mountain and from a few spots on the side of the mountain.
We unleashed a volcano.
Nonsense. Such power is the province of the saints. We only, well...
The saints work in mysterious ways, my friend.
Theo remained speechless as he stared at the awesome and terrible display before them.
We really needed to go.
Everyone jumped at realization and began to move. Raisin, still limping from the burn in his thigh, led them away from the mountainside. Each crack of a fresh eruption made them cringe, fearing this was the one that would drop a flaming boulder in their midst. Each gust of heated wind and pressure had them fearing a surge of lava was about to sweep over them and burn them alive. Their fear lent speed to their feet and kept exhaustion at bay as they fled into the night. Chapter 8. Theo opened his eyes to chaos. His senses were assaulted by the wild, beautiful, natural chaos. There were blossoming trees surrounding a small glade that he lay in. The blossoms' flowers were white, pink, yellow, and orange, varying from tree to tree. Yet defining those colors didn't feel like it did them justice. They were so vibrant and alive. The grass he lay on was soft and luxurious, more so than any better hammock he'd ever been in. He could smell the grass and earth beneath him as though it had just been through a gentle spring rain. Bright yellow flowers marked a path through the trees off to his right. On his left was his bundle of clothes and equipment. He sat up slowly, stretching his body and feeling the weariness from their frantic travels was gone. He felt hale and hearty, like he had been touched by blessing himself even though he knew he had not called for her power. He was also naked. Theo frowned and looked around again. He thought he heard the tinkling noise of bells, that and perhaps some giggles of laughter, but he couldn't place it. The jungle around him was so thick with growth, he could only imagine there was movement within it out of the corner of her. His eyes. It was warm, warmer than it had been last time they'd been in Queen Satine's realm. They'd ran for hours and then slowed to a walk when running wasn't possible. He'd been the first to falter, but they urged him on. Raisin had even given him a shoulder to lean on to keep him going, though the man's legs still had the terrible burn from the lava. The rest had been a blur of exhaustion and agony. Theo remembered all of them struggling at one point or another. Even Lady Arika had been staggering as they made their way back through the forest.
You're awake.
Theo let out a gasp and turned to see Annie emerging from a pathway that had not existed a moment before. His hands flew to his crotch and he nearly dropped to his side in the process. Annie giggled, her smile making her eyes dance with delight.
It's okay. You don't need to hide yourself. You are natural and beautiful as you are.
Theo blushed in spite of her words. Annie was still nude, aside from the long hair that fell down her body and did nothing to conceal her. Raisin said time worked funny here, but Annie didn't look any older since he'd seen her last. Still, her hair had somehow grown in his few days of absence.
Thank you.
Theo said as he reached for his clothes. A bundle made of woven leaves was on top of his clothes. He frowned and picked it up. It was soft and pliable, like a cloth sack. Tiny vines wrapped around the top opened when he prodded them, revealing luscious red berries inside.
What is this?
A gift from Queen Satine. Each berry is touched by her magic and will fill you as though you've eaten a full meal. Each one can soothe aches and pains and even mend wounds if you smear it on the cut.
A gift indeed. Thank you.
Don't thank me, thank Queen Satine.
Theo bowed his head.
I will, if I may. I mean, where is she? And my friends, are they, well?
She held out a hand and wiggled her fingers.
Come, I will take you to them.
Yes. Just let me get dressed first.
Annie pouted, her eyes darting down his body and then to his clothes.
If you must.
Theo blushed again.
I must.
He dressed quickly and found that his clothes had not only been cleaned, but mended so well that they felt brand new. He tried not to be amazed by the magic at play here, but he was unsettled at the mystery and majesty of this place. He pulled the vines tight about the berries and placed them in his pack, taking care not to crush them.
Come, I will show you.
Once he had the last of his things settled and sorted, she took his hand and pulled him down the path lined with yellow flowers into the jungle. Theo looked about as they walked, noticing for this first time that the jungle was entirely that, a jungle and not a forest. The trees were different this time around. The flowers and all bushes more tropical. It made sense with the warmth in the air and the droplets of water that gathered on leaves and flowers. Their journey between glades was neither too long nor too short. It ended abruptly, but seemed to be just the right time for it to do so. Theo found himself in a small clearing where his companions had already gathered. Each looked as fit and restored as he felt. Even the charred hole in Raisin's trousers was fixed as though it had never been. Lady Arika looked as healthy and fit as ever, but unlike the rest of them, she stood every bit as bare as Annie. The difference was Annie looked youthful and innocent, a young woman recently thrust into womanhood. Lady Arika replaced innocence with confidence, poise, and a body built for pleasure. Theo blushed at the thought and looked away from Lady Arika. He caught Delaney admiring her and almost chuckled. The woman was no wizard, but she could easily catch a man in her spell. Arika looked to him as he walked up to them.
At last. Are you well?
More so than I have any right to be.
Grunts and nods from the others showed they felt the same way. Delaney took a drink from a wineskin made of woven leaves. The way he sighed after he swallowed was all the evidence Theo needed to know that he'd been given something far better than goblin ale to drink in it.
Annabelle, will you take us to Queen Satine now?
Annie frowned a little at the use of her full name and then brightened.
Of course, please follow me.
Off they went down another yellow flower-lined path. Like Theo's last trip between groves, this one seemed to stretch on only as long as it needed to. The path opened into another natural courtyard that looked quite different than the Queen's chambers, yet felt almost the same. The difference was in the decorations. The trees, flowers, vines, and even Satine's smooth black throne that looked to have been shaped from obsidian. The members of the court had changed and grown in number as well. Beings with horns, tails, cloven hooves, wings, and all manner of oddities lined the hall. 2 elves stood to either side of the Queen's throne.
Come.
Annie urged them and continued into the middle of the hall and walked until she stood before the stream that separated them from the Queen's throne. Colorful tropical fish darted back and forth in the stream, another sign of change from what they'd seen before. When everyone came to a stop next to Annie, a brief rush of warm raindrops fell over them. They struck softly and ran through the hair and over their bodies, leaving them feeling refreshed and no worse for it. It passed in seconds, and with its passing, so too went the water, leaving them as dry as before they'd come. A soft flutter of wings and the songs of birds drew their eyes up as a figure descended on butterfly wings. She wore an elegant green dress that sat low on her shoulders and even lower between her small breasts. It clung to her body and fell just shy of her ankles. She landed between the throne and stream and stood still for a moment, slowly beating her wings and then drawing them back. She stepped back and sat on her throne, her wings having disappeared altogether so she didn't crush them. She smiled, and the birds in the trees took flight and began an aerial dance above them.
I welcome you back as heroes. You are all well, I hope?
Well enough. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Queen Satine.
Before Arika could continue, the Queen smiled at her and looked down at herself.
Your eyes covet my dress.
It is beautiful. I took note, so I might have one made in its image.
Pity that. You are beautiful as you are. Surely you must know this.
I am. Beauty can be hidden or with the proper touch enhanced. You have clearly chosen the latter.
Queen Satine laughed and the birds chirped gaily above them.
You have the tongue of a fox. For the deed you have done, you may have it.
Arika tilted her head slightly.
Have what?
This.
Satine lifted her arms enough to gesture at her dress. At the end of the simple wave, her dress disappeared, leaving the Queen standing brazenly nude before them. A thin patch of hair concealed her sex, while her small breasts sat proud and firm upon her chest. Her belly was slender and slim, giving only the slightest bump to show where her hip bones began and rounded out her figure. Equally surprising was the new dress that appeared around Arika and clung to her curves in all the right places. Arika let out a gasp and looked down at her new garment. It was so soft and smooth against her skin that she wouldn't have felt like she was wearing anything had it not appeared the way it had. No, that wasn't quite true. It was soft, but it also hugged her in ways that offered support she'd never had before. She looked back up at the Queen and bowed her head deeply.
Thank you. This is a gift, but I fear I do not deserve such a thing.
It is yours now. Do with it as you wish. Be sure to water it and give it some sunlight from time to time, and I think you will find it is not so delicate as you think.
Arika's eyes widened.
It's alive?
The Queen's eyes twinkled as she smiled. Ganner cleared his throat, gaining her attention.
You didn't tell us about the volcano.
Didn't I? I told you to go to it, did I not?
Ganner lifted his chin.
The remnant's thralls were drawing his power and using it to try and awaken him.
You have restored the natural flow, and in doing so there was a backlash of what had already built up. It will return to normal in time.
How much time? Will the eruption threaten the people?
Satine shrugged.
Time is relative. The natural order is restored. That is what matters. That is the deed I tasked you with. For that, I will grant you what my scouts have learned.
They waited expectantly. Delaunay even leaned forward a little more. Whether it was an excuse to ogle her natural beauty more openly or not was a secret he kept to himself.
The birds have seen wagons traveling along roads to the south. Wagons with cages and covers above them. The animals have scented the smells of children. The trees pass along these whispers as they rub their branches. They also warn of how they are used and hurt with the passing of the wagons.
Wagons to the south. There was a road, and someone mentioned a wagon.
What about being used and hurt? Just the trees? Or the birds and the animals, too?
She paused and then smiled.
Since you mentioned it, I could offer you another chance to set right that which is wrong.
Arika hesitated before asking.
Depends. Do you have more dresses?
Arika!
What?
Queen Satine laughed again.
You should hurry! Those you seek will not last long.
Wait, what about this other task?
Raisin groaned.
The people that have taken your children, they are unnatural. They do not fit in the proper order of this island. Rid this place of them, and you will correct that, and should you do it before the children are lost.
Lost? Then we should go.
One more thing.
Satine raised an eyebrow and the birds ceased their chirping and swept overhead, faster and lower.
Annie, we need to take Annabelle back.
Satine turned her attention to Annie.
Do you wish to return, my sweet?
Annie frowned and then her expression brightened.
I would like to see my parents again, but everything here is so beautiful and nice. I don't know. You will not know suffering and hardship here.
Annie hesitated.
These are your people, your friends and family.
Annie nodded.
Yes, I would like to see them. I see. You may visit them if you wish.
She may visit them. That's...
Raisin turned to face his companions.
Annie's lived her most of her life. She's tied to this realm.
The angel spawn is right.
The angel spawn has a name.
Satine's grin had a dangerous twist to it. She turned her gaze back on Annie, and the hardness softened in her eyes.
So you do. You are young, but I would allow you to be our emissary to your realm.
You would have to spend time here, for food and drink out there will not sustain you for long. You would waste away to nothing.
Not nothing.
Satine looked at him again.
No, not nothing. Nothing might be better. I don't know what to do. How long would I have? Days, perhaps even a week or two. Take some berries with you and that will help.
Annie nodded.
Oh, okay. But you must come back. You are a lovely child, Annie. I enjoy our walks and our talks in the gardens. Your parents are out there, true, but your family is here.
Annie's eyes watered. She sniffed and wiped her unshed tears away.
I understand. I'll go, and I'll come back. I'll be your emissary, my queen.
Satine smiled at her.
You are such a sweet thing, Annie.
Annie blushed and turned to the others.
So, I'll go with you, but I have to come back.
We heard.
Delaunay slapped the dwarf's shoulder. Slab glared back at the elf.
We should be off.
Arika said while absently rubbing her hand across the fabric of her new dress. Theo nodded and hiked up his pack to adjust it on his back.
Yes, those children are in danger.
Right. Yes, we must save the children.
Thank you for listening to Fall of Fireskin Part 2. Like, subscribe, and click to be notified when the next one, Lord of Tigers, is available.